Almost 40 years ago, a powerful reunion between a lion and the men who raised him was caught on film. And today, it's become an internet sensation that's touched the hearts of millions.
I really got goosebumps and I really got excited.
And it was a California student who first posted the clip on YouTube.
The way he just runs up to them and embraces them is just beautiful.
Your eyes well up with tears. It's like, this is really amazing.
It has to be the kind of ultimate moment.
So sweet.
The story began in 1960s London when two friends bought a lion cub from a trendy department store and introduced it into the city's swinging social scene.
The reaction was probably universally, "You've both gone mad."
But the lion, called Christian, soon grew too big for apartment life.
We knew that the time was coming where we had to accept that London was no longer going to be his home.
The two friends traveled across the globe to Africa to release him.
They're giving him up selflessly so he can be free.
And together with one of the world's top conservationists, they helped Christian fight for a life in an African pride.
He thought he was the only lion in the world.
It was a chapter of his life that saw his deadly rival become his new companion.
They became absolutely closest of friends.
But even with his new African life, the bond between the men and the lion could not be broken.
It was really quite sort of euphoric.
He was just so excited.
Millions have seen the touching reunion on the internet, but few know the incredible true story that led up to this now famous scene.
Now I'm going to cry.
This is the true story of Christian the Lion. London, England is one of the world's major business, political, and cultural centers. In 1969, the capital was known as Swinging London and was at the heart of a cultural revolution in fashion and music. King's Road, in the hippest part of London, was a magnet for artists and travelers eager to take part in the city's hedonistic lifestyle. It was here that college friends John Rendell and Ace Burke came from Australia to make their mark.
Well, it was a well-worn path. In fact, it was like a rite of passage.
And Australians headed for London. It was the Mecca. It was where everything was happening. It was the exciting, swinging London.
We did know a lot of quite well-known people.
The Rolling Stones, you would see them driving up and down the King's Road. This was a fantastic time to be in London.
Along with the partying with rock stars and actors, the newly arrived Australians took a trip to see Harrods, London's world-famous department store, which even had its own zoo where you could buy any animal under the sun.
People would say that you could get anything from Harrods, from a pin to an elephant. And we did actually get an elephant for somebody at one time.
Yes. Hand-reared cubs, of course, because these are so very much tamer.
In November 1969, Harrods put two 3-month-old lion cubs up for sale. They came from Ilfracombe Zoo in Devon, the 5th generation of their family to be born in captivity.
It was an absolutely astounding moment to just look and see these two beautiful creatures for sale.
Christian was just full of personality, and he was so irresistible.
And we just kind of looked at each other and said, right, we're going to buy it.
In the 60s, exotic pets were all the rage and perfectly legal. It was not until 1976 that the Endangered Species Act, a law restricting their sale, came into force. Harrods interviewed Ace, John, and every other interested buyer to ensure that the lion cubs went to responsible owners.
John asked all the right questions, wanted to know what the pitfalls would be, and always felt that they would do the best for Christian anyway.
Ace and John passed the Harrods test and bought Christian for 250 guineas, the equivalent of more than $4,000 today. Neither one had any experience with big cats.
The reaction to us buying Christian was probably universally, you've both gone mad, and it's quite dangerous, and you're stupid, and it'll end in tears.
Ace and John soon realized that bringing up a lion in the middle of London was going to be a huge challenge. Their first problem was where to keep their boisterous new pet. Both worked as salesmen at Sophisticat, a shop selling restored pine furniture in the King's Road, and they lived in the apartment above. They persuaded the owners to let Christian have the run of the shop's large basement.
There was some furniture stored down there that was going to be restored, and so that he could climb on and hide under or creep around and play hide and seek.
He loved toys, but he'd shred a teddy bear in 2 seconds flat. He loved waste paper baskets, and you could chew it, shred it, wear it on your head.
But the cleaning lady who came to the apartment had Christian's favorite toys.
He thought she was there just as a kind of cabaret, because she had dusters and mops and vacuum cleaners and things.
So he would put his paws on the front of the carpet sweeper and we'd play push-pull, and then he'd steal my dusters and stuff like that. It was great fun.
She wasn't frightened of him at all. I mean, not in the slightest.
And of course my children used to go back to school and say, don't mess with us because our mom looks after a lion.
As Christian grew bigger, so did the challenges of raising an African lion in a city. At 6 months old, he was already devouring 7 pounds of meat a day and was proving to be very expensive. Friends and admirers rallied round to help satisfy Christian's growing appetite.
There was a chef from a nearby restaurant who brought him fabulous meat that we had rather had our eye on, very nice steaks.
It was an expense to keep him, so we thought, what can we do? So we met a photographer called Derek Catani, who was a friend of a friend, and he came along and started a record of Christian's life in London.
And so I said, well, let's get together a couple of feature ideas. And I said, well, Easter's coming up now. Let's think about something to do with Easter and Easter chicks. It was an amazing situation because we thought that a great big paw was going to come down on this poor little chick, None of it. He was so gentle.
I think we got £30 for the photograph, which was very good.
So Christian was helping to pay for his hefty meat bill. But there was another problem. The growing cub needed serious outdoor exercise. But where in London would you find a safe place for a lion to run? The touching internet story of Christian the lion has gathered an extraordinary following. But the YouTube clip is only a glimpse of the amazing journey of 2 men and their lion. This adventure started in 60s London, where John and Ace became the proud owners of a lion cub. Christian lived in their apartment basement, but was growing up fast and desperately needed a place to run. The friends discovered a walled cemetery attached to a church in Chelsea. They thought the open space would make the perfect exercise enclosure for Christian. Ace and John managed to persuade Reverend Williamson, the church minister, to let them exercise Christian in his cemetery.
My father had a wicked sense of humour of having a lion exercising over graveyards of Christians. On the other hand, he was also a great naturalist, and he would have recognised a real need to let the lion have some freedom rather than being cooped up in a shop or a house.
Ace and John didn't know it, but Christian wasn't just playing games. He was learning to be a lion. Through play fighting and chasing, he was developing the hunting skills he'd need to survive in the wild. Christian's lion instincts were surfacing. But after 4 months of constant attention from Ace and John, he had clearly formed a strong bond with them.
He was dependent on us, but he loved us back as well. We were the closest things to him.
But Christian had such a personality that he was sort of another person in their lives, wasn't he?
He would always leap in, put his arms around them. They would put their arms around him.
It was just like having a child, and it was like John and Ace were his parents. He just adored them. It's where he looked at them. You can see the love in his eyes.
Christian was now 8 months old and weighed 160 pounds. Christian's size was becoming a problem.
As he grew bigger, we were worried what would happen next. He was really capable of inflicting real damage.
Once, I think I'd been out for the evening and I called him, and he ran up the stairs to put his hands on my shoulders like he does, and he slipped on the top step and put his claws out and ripped my whole dress off the front of me. My beaver dress, my best beaver dress.
It was becoming clear to Ace and John that their pet was growing to be a predator at the top of the food chain.
One day he found a fur belt had dropped off some customer's coat in the shop, and he picked it up, and I went to pull it away from him. And for the first time he flattened his ears and snarled in a very, very nasty way, signaling very clearly, I'm having this, don't try and take it away from me.
Christian's size was also putting his exercise regime in peril.
Towards the end, as Christian got larger, I think my father felt a little bit uncomfortable, the larger the lion got, how long this could continue for, and suggested that it might have to stop.
So we knew that the time was coming where we had to accept that London was no longer going to be his home.
Christian needed a new home. But Ace and John refused to consider putting Christian in a circus or zoo. They didn't want him living in captivity, like his parents.
We just knew that we couldn't betray him by putting him in a zoo. We thought, we've got to find something. What was it going to be? We didn't know.
Ace and John were getting desperate, but then an extraordinary chance encounter changed everything. English film stars Bill Travers and Virginia McKenna visited the Kings Road furniture shop and came face to face with Christian. Ace and John saw an opportunity.
When they met us, I think they thought, what about, is there a chance here? Because they said to Bill, do you think you could help us to get Christian, you know, a better future? And he said, would you agree to let Christian go back to the wild?
Joy Adamson's well-known story of life with the lions has now been brought to the screen. It was chosen for the Royal Film performance in London.
Travers and McKenna had starred in the 60s box office hit Born Free 4 years earlier. It told the true story of an orphan lion cub, Elsa, who was successfully released back into the wild. The experience turned the actors into passionate lion conservationists, and they were still in touch with the man whose work had inspired the film. George Adamson was a lion expert who hand-reared orphan cubs like Elsa, preparing them for life in the wild. It was controversial work. Some experts said the lions' familiarity with humans made them potential man-killers. But for John and Ace, Adamson represented Christian's best chance of freedom.
So they contacted George Adamson, and he then said, what an exciting challenge to be able to try, he did stress try, and rehabilitate a fifth-generation zoo-bred lion. Because Elsa was born in Africa. Elsa knew the smells of Africa. Elsa knew what a waterbuck looked like. Christian didn't.
It was the perfect solution. We were just thrilled. Anything to avoid a safer, longer life in confinement, in cages. So we didn't hesitate for a moment.
But there was a major stumbling block. They needed permission from the Kenyan government to import Christian. Negotiations would be complex and lengthy. The rapidly growing Christian needed somewhere bigger to live, and fast. A lion called Christian found fame after a YouTube clip showed the emotional reunion of him with the men who raised him. Christian grew up in London's swinging 60s, but soon outgrew his surroundings, and plans were made to move him to Africa. The negotiations to move Christian to Kenya could take months, but the lion was quickly outgrowing city life. Actors and passionate conservationists, Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers, offered a temporary solution: the run of their country estate 30 miles outside of London.
It was marvelous when we first got there. You know, he jumped out and then just didn't take off, but just him walking without us guiding him, trying to lead him or control him. Scared by the scarecrow in their garden. And again, he didn't run off. He just would go ahead and investigate and then come back to us for reassurance.
Virginia and Bill built Christian a huge, secure compound. It was the closest he had ever been to the wild.
Christian, he was obviously delighted when he moved to the country. You know, it was a different environment, and he loved his space there.
Ace and John gave up their jobs and moved into a caravan beside the compound. They knew these were the last weeks they'd have with Christian, and they wanted to make the most of every second.
Think of ways to keep him interested. That was to stimulate him, you know, so he didn't get fed up and bored. We took him very early one morning to go to West Wittering and run on the beach with balloons. When he dipped his paw in the sea and hated it, you see, oh, I don't like this, he went off. So we were all, I think I remember my husband was rushing along, waving a balloon in the air or something, but Christian didn't want to, he just wanted to race. He just raced on the beach, and we all puffed and blew after him, you know, and then we all flopped into the sand.
Four weeks after Christian's move to the country, there was still no word from the Kenyan government. And the delay meant that the 9-month-old Christian was outgrowing his compound.
He occasionally tried to climb the wire, so we did in fact build like an overhang to just ensure he wouldn't get out.
The situation would only get worse as Christian got bigger. And Ace and John were starting to worry that the Kenyans were going to refuse to let Christian into their country.
We did get scared that it could all fall through, so we got quite worried.
The zoo life Ace and John hoped to avoid was suddenly becoming Christian's only option. But then, after 3 months of negotiations, good news. The Kenyan government approved the transport of Christian the lion from London to Africa. Legendary wildlife conservationist George Adamson offered Christian a place at his reserve in Kenya. The young lion was on his way to Africa.
We get him out to Heathrow. We gave him a very mild sedative, which was recommended by various vets and London Zoo.
I remember we stood there and we saw him, and then they put something in the front so that he couldn't see anymore. And then he was lifted on the hoist up into the hold, and it was quite heart-stopping, actually.
That was scary, seeing him loaded into the hold at Heathrow, and we weren't really sure if he'd survive the journey.
The trip to Nairobi was monumental for a young lion who'd never been out of London. It was 15 hours before Bill Travers, Ace, and John arrived in Africa and were reunited with Christian.
And it was just a huge relief to see him at the other end.
Christian had made it to Africa, but now he faced a much tougher journey, finding his place among dangerous wild lions. The powerful reunion between John Rendell, Ace Burke, and their lion in Africa was posted on the internet and reached millions of viewers. The London lion had made it safely to Africa. Christian's survival in the wild was now in the hands of one man, George Adamson.
He was smaller than we imagined and quite dapper, in quite a crisp sort of safari suit.
This unassuming gentleman was a revered, if controversial, figure in Kenya, where his practice of training domesticated lions to return to the wild was seen by some as risky to humans. George was taking Christian to Kora Nature Reserve in a deserted part of the country. There, he hoped to establish a new lion pride with Christian at its heart.
We were driving up, Christian was in the back, and I knew he wanted to go to the loo. So I said, look, Mr. Adamson, please, we've got to stop. And George said, look, we're in the middle of nowhere. If he runs off, he said, we'll never catch him.
We very, very confidently said, no, he won't run off.
Christian got out, went to the loo, and I said, OK, come on, back you get. So he just jumped straight back into the Land Rover.
And in fact, George was very impressed.
George said, well, that's quite remarkable. I think he's going to be fine, and you can call me George. So I turned around to Christian and said, yes, yes, we'll be all right.
After traveling more than 200 miles, Ace, John, and Christian arrive at Kora Nature Reserve, Christian's new home in the wild.
It must have been extraordinary for Christian to suddenly find himself in such a totally alien environment.
He might have been in a new continent, but Christian still demanded his home comforts.
The first night in Africa was a bit embarrassing, really. Ace had a bunk here, and I had a stretcher here, a stretcher there, and Christian was there. Well, of course, he slept on one of the beds with a pillow.
With beds, pillows, and photographer Derek Katani there to capture this new chapter of his life, Christian must have felt Africa was his home away from home.
Watching Christian's reaction to crocodiles and hippo popping their heads out of the water, he didn't want to be aggressive towards them. He just thought that they were part of the landscape.
The relaxed demeanor of Ace, John, and Christian masked the reality. Christian was a London lion in Africa, and his background put him at great risk. George Adamson's plans were to create a pride with Christian and two other lions, Catania, an orphan lioness cub, and Boy, an adult male, born and domesticated in Africa. All three would be released into the wild together, but first they had to bond, a very new experience for Christian.
He thought he was the only lion in the world, and it was a shock to meet one that was 3 times his size.
The first time he saw Boy, you can imagine, he hasn't seen a mature lion since his father. And there's this enormous and very cross lion, too.
For Boy, Christian was a threat. In prides, younger lions often attempt to usurp an older lion's position.
His first reaction when he saw Christian was very aggressive and frightening.
He would keep charging at the wire to really scare Christian, and he was scared, and we were scared too, I can tell you.
Christian got in behind our legs and sort of snarled unhappily.
Christian could not hide behind John and Ace forever. If George's pride was going to work, Christian and Boy would need to face each other outside the compound to establish the pride's hierarchy.
One day, George said, we just have to bite the bullet. We just have to do it. And George and Ace and John and Christian walked up this rock to where Boy was sitting. Boy rose, and he seemed to double in size, and his mane sort of swelled. He looked truly, truly frightening.
This was a moment of life or death.
It's really terrifying to see this huge, fully grown lion coming down and just belting Christian.
The gentle London lion was now fighting for his life. Christian the Lion became an internet sensation, and his story attracted millions of hits. Now the London Lion is in Kenya and about to come nose to nose with Boy, a 400-pound adult male lion. It's a critical test for Christian and his first chance to be accepted into an African pride.
In the quickness of the movements, we thought he could be killed.
But amazingly, Christian's lion instinct kicked in.
Christian snarled but rolled onto his back in the correct submission to an adult lion.
Christian stood it, he didn't run away, and he obviously knew that this was part of being a lion was.
Battling for position within a pride is normal lion behavior. Christian wasn't injured by Boy's attack, but had been put in his place.
Boy had established he was the boss, he was the father of the pride, as it were, and Christian knew his place, and they became absolutely closest of friends.
George Adamson was pleased his first Cora pride was finally taking shape, but now there was no longer a role for Ace and John.
We could see it was starting to work, and we had to step back, and the relationship that we had with Christian, we had to pass on to George. It was sad to leave him, but there was a moment of thinking, you know, there you are, you're in the right place, the right man, and you've really got a chance.
The fact that we'd got him there and he would probably have a future there, it made our feelings not irrelevant, but that was such a good feeling.
Ace and John's life had centered on Christian for over a year. Now, after 4 weeks with him in Kenya, it was time to leave him with his new family, his lion pride.
He did pad down the track as we left, and that was sad.
Returning to London without Christian was difficult for John and Ace, but George Adamson sent through regular bulletins on Christian's progress.
It was always, you know, the good news of how he and Boy were getting along, so it really kept us up to date with what was happening.
The news from Cora in the 2 months since they left was that Boy and Christian had become inseparable. They would disappear away from George's compound for days at a time. An African lion teaching the European youngster the ways of the wild. Cora was not just home to Boy and Christian. It was also home to rival wild lions, and this made life fraught with danger.
Boy and Christian, being males, were always going to have trouble with the wild lions. They were never going to just let them carve their own territory out in their territory.
8 months after John and Ace left, the Cora Pride was working to establish its territory. But then, a major setback. A vicious clash with the rival lions left Boy seriously injured. And although his wounds eventually healed, his temperament changed. On June 6, 1971, Boy trekked to the compound where George and his staff, including his assistant Stanley, lived. Stanley came outside the compound and was attacked by Boy.
The first thing that was heard was this shrieking. George grabbed his gun and saw Stanley in Boy's mouth. And George had no alternative but to shoot Boy. And Stanley actually died too from his wounds. He never recovered. So it was a double and terrible tragedy.
Stanley's tragic death marked a painful turning point at Cora. George had lost a faithful assistant and friend. Christian lost Boy, the leader of his pride, and would sit by Boy's grave for hours on end. Now, as the pride's only male, Christian was on his own. George Adamson brought a new assistant, Tony Fitzjohn, a 25-year-old with a love for wildlife. Tony was new to Cora and had not known Christian long, but he noticed the lion's melancholy.
He did miss Boy. It did add to his fear level. Boy wasn't there anymore. It was sort of, how do I cope now? What do I do? You know, why is he gone? Where's he gone? And there's always that period of worry and uncertainty, non-understanding of why someone suddenly disappeared. But they get themselves together pretty quickly and have to, you know, sort of create their own lives.
Boy's death and Christian's loneliness was heartbreaking news for John and Ace. They'd been away from Christian for a year and decided it was time to go back.
We weren't sure of our reception this time. We always thought anything could happen. It was very dangerous. It was the wilds of Africa.
After an anxious day in the compound, Ace and John walked onto Christian's territory. George might be welcome here, but Ace and John were almost strangers. They hadn't seen Christian in a year. If he perceived them as unwelcome guests, there could be trouble.
George appeared on the top of the hill, I suppose about 100 meters away from us, with Christian. Christian ambled down another 10 or 15 meters and had a very long, hard look at us.
You could just see him assessing what was going on. He kept walking slowly, slowly down towards us.
And I think that was the point where we actually couldn't bear it any longer and actually called out his name.
And at that moment, the pace picks up. And he was just so excited. And of course we were. I mean, imagine how excited we were.
It was just an incredible reunion. Whether we were human or he was animal was sort of irrelevant.
Christian's acceptance of John and Ace was mirrored by the Lionesses. They were brought to Cora 3 months earlier to develop the pride. They too welcomed the newcomers.
Suddenly, we were aware that those 2 lionesses were with us as well, and they were greeting us and pushing and shoving.
We had these lions we didn't know milling around us, Christian jumping up on us, George beaming. It was really quite sort of euphoric. It's actually quite hard to find the words for it. Everyone, lions, humans, all felt we'd shared something very, very special. So it was very emotional for all of us, and we knew we'd been part of or witnessed something quite extraordinary.
Christian's London family relaxed with his African family, the Lionesses, and an orphan cub. Ace and John were confident that Christian had found his home in Africa.
To leave him the second time was easier, really, because you knew he was such a success. Had a wonderful relationship with George. He obviously had a powerful relationship with the Lionesses, and he was huge.
Ace and John went back to London, reassured about Christian's future. But a growing lion reaching maturity could be a serious threat to those around them.
George told us adolescence was the most dangerous time for lions. That's when he was most wary of them. Christian, at around this time, had in fact knocked Tony to the ground.
He flattened me, put my head in his mouth, rolled over on his back and proceeded to kick me with his back legs. And then he thought that was a lot of fun, so then he shook me a bit and then he dropped me. And I was getting quite scared. He was this huge, great guy just playing with me like a rag doll. And so he came straight for me, so I punched him straight in the nose. And it worked, and he veered off. It must have been like a tap to him, you know, because they're so tough.
Ace and John had wanted Christian to grow up in Africa, to find his place in the wild. But as he grew bigger and more aggressive, would further contact with them become too risky? Ace and John's extraordinary reunion with their lion Christian in 1971 has become a YouTube phenomenon. But a year after that now famous scene, the two friends made the journey back to Kenya, hoping to see Christian again.
George had been keeping us up to date with what was happening, and that he'd been disappearing for months on end, and was obviously looking to establish his own territory further away from Cora.
George warned us that he mightn't even come to camp. We still thought it was worthwhile going, just in case we did see him.
After 3 days, Christian finally arrived at the compound, and these rarely seen images show the large adult lion he had become.
This time, he was very different from the year before. He had matured considerably. He was much, much bigger. He was much more, I'm grown up now.
He was so incredibly handsome, incredibly lovely. All lions loved him, all humans loved him. He was extraordinary. He lost none of his charisma.
He'd be sitting with us, and then suddenly he'd get up and he'd just walk away and sit somewhere else.
We were undoubtedly more superfluous to his life.
It was like, now I've got lion things to do.
Christian might be a proud 500-pound lion, but he hadn't forgotten all of his playful London ways.
The very last night we had with Christian really was enormous fun.
Everyone was so relaxed and laughing, and he was just happy to be around him.
We were all smoking cigarettes in those days and drinking. So, of course, we all were up all night laughing and joking, and Christian being silly.
Sitting on us, on the table, totally disrupting us.
And the next day he goes back up to the Lionesses. Christian, of course, being up all night, was kind of obviously, he had a night out with the boys. Kind of just turned around and went, oh, wallop, and just collapsed.
John and Ace didn't know it, but it would be the last time they would see their beloved lion.
We went up to see him that night, and he'd gone.
You think you will be back, you will hear news, it'll be a continuing story. And in fact, it was the last time.
He'd gone. He wasn't going to come back.
John and Ace never saw Christian again.
He was no longer dependent on any of us. And that was the most wonderful success. He'd done it.
We just hoped that he'd found his own territory, had his own cubs, had his own pride, and had a marvellous, normal, natural life.
Christian, the London-born lion, was given the extraordinary opportunity to live wild in Africa. John and Ace are convinced that they did the right thing, giving him back his freedom. But it was the first posting of their reunion clip without music or subtitles by a California student in 2006 that turned their story into an international phenomenon.
Hi. Hello. I just really believe that video needed to be seen. I was surprised it wasn't anywhere else on YouTube or on the internet anywhere else. I couldn't find anything.
Why do you think it has been so popular on YouTube?
Well, I think it's striking people on a very powerful basis of love. I'm really glad that the internet's out there and is raising awareness, and I'm glad to have been a part of it.
It's like a gift to the world, really. That's how we see it.
Special hug. Thanks.
Special hug.
Since Lisa's posting, several versions of the clip were embellished with music and titles.
It is quite mind-boggling. 50 million people have watched the reunion video. And we do wonder, how can we harness that incredible goodwill and interest?
People have been touched by this. People have seen this video and they've just been affected by it.
It's a beautiful story.
I was just blown away.
It was very moving.
Christian's story exploded and prompted the release of an updated book about his life.
I do think it's all meant to be, I think, possibly it's a cry for Africa from Christian from 40 years ago.
Raise awareness of conservation and the need to protect endangered species. What a fantastic legacy he's left.